Okay, I think we're going to get started. How does that sound? Is everybody, Lucas, you good? You can hear me okay? Okay, great. So good afternoon. I'm Marjorie Kaplan, and along with my colleague Lucas Markson, we co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center here at Rutgers University. Our center was created by statute, and we're a center of applied climate research, practice, and education to help New Jersey mitigate, plan, and adapt to climate change. And for those of you not familiar, you can find out more about our center, watch past webinars, explore our climate mapping tools for New Jersey, and read our reports. We welcome your participation in today's webinar and, of course, our other upcoming events, which include a May 27th conversation with the Chief Resilience Officers from New Jersey and Philadelphia, which will be online. And on June 10th, we have our New Jersey Climate Change Research Symposium that will highlight the latest natural and social science, economics, engineering, and policy climate research for New Jersey. It will be in person on campus here at Rutgers University, and I'll put links to all of this in the chat. So give me 1 second and I will put these in the chat. Let's see where we are. And get this one. So today's webinar is going to last until 1 o'clock, and we're recording today's webinar, and it will be available on our website. I will also put that into the chat. And other than today's presenters and our Rutgers team, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. We've allocated some time at the end to get to your questions, so put them into the chat for our speakers. And we're going to be monitoring the chat behind the scenes and gathering your questions so you can send them to us throughout the webinar. So let's turn to today's presentation on the potential and challenges for thermal energy networks in New Jersey. So next slide, please, Oliver. It's my pleasure to introduce three really amazing colleagues to present their recent report on this topic. We have with us today Dr. Jennifer Senick, the Assistant Dean for Research, a member of the PhD faculty, and Senior Executive Director of the Center for Urban Policy Research at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And joining Dr. Senick, also from the Center for Urban Policy Research, are Senior Research Specialist Arah Schuur, as well as Senior Research Specialist Yousaf Shahid. And as Arah shares her screen, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Senick, and I'll also put in the chat a link to their report.
Thank you, Marjorie.
Take it away, Jen.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge I saw in the chat that there was an echo. Has that resolved? I would suggest if there's still problems with that, probably we just need to make sure everybody has muted. Okay. Well, thanks again. We're really great. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to present this report to you and to interact with you through your questions. I just want to briefly introduce the Rutgers Center for Urban Policy Research, with whom we are all affiliated. The center has served the nation for 5 decades through basic and applied research on a broad spectrum of public policy issues. The Center for Urban Policy Research, or CUPR, works to make human settlements more equitable, sustainable, resilient, and healthy through research, public engagement, education, and other forms of capacity building and practice. We have several practice and research areas which are on at least my right side of the slide, and I'll just briefly read them. Built environment and green building, environmental analysis and communications, infrastructure networks, urban policy, data informatics, and Blaustein Local, which refers to services we provide to local and state governmental officials. While our geographic focus is in New Jersey and the Northeast more broadly, we also conduct research with both national and international scopes. And I'll just add that today's presentation derives from our multi-decade engagement with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, our client, for whom we perform market research and evaluation services. And with that, I will now turn our presentation over to Arah Schuur. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon to present this. I'm Arah Schuur. I led this study with Yousaf and Dr. Senick and a number of other folks at CUPR on behalf of the Board of Public Utilities. I'm actually based in Massachusetts, which is home to the first operational utility thermal energy network. So it was a real treat for me to be able to dive in on this topic and look at the potential for TENS in New Jersey. And I will note that this was a legislatively directed study. Legislation passed in January of 2024, directing the Board of Public Utilities to study the feasibility, marketability, benefits, and costs of the implementation of large-scale geothermal systems. So this study was very focused on the directives in that legislation, and you'll see how we analyzed and came out with the results. And it asked us not only to look at that, but also to provide recommendations, including for pilot studies, financial or other incentives, legislative, executive, or other action that would help unlock the market for thermal energy networks. Just so you know, thermal energy networks are low temperature, ground source, and other thermal energy source systems that provide heating and cooling, including water heating, for a series of buildings that are connected together by an underground loop. In this study, we focused on multi-customer thermal energy networks. So that's thermal energy networks comprised of buildings that are multiple utility customers, because it has the most barriers to implementation. And throughout this presentation, you'll hear us use TENS, geothermal heat pumps, and geothermal systems interchangeably, but the focus of the report was on multi-customer TENS. To implement the study, we did a number of things. Of course, we did a literature review. We looked at a lot of other jurisdictions in the US and beyond and how they are implementing these kind of systems. We also spoke to over 30 stakeholders, a number of whom were called out in legislation by name. So the US Department of Energy, utilities in New Jersey and in other states, as well as a number of other types of organizations. And finally, we and our subcontractor, Borough Happold, did several types of energy modeling to look at the impacts and potential for thermal energy networks. The study was peer-reviewed by both industry and nonprofit researchers familiar with TENS before it was published, and it was published in February. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be a QR code where you can find it. I will talk about the first modeling. We contracted with Borough Happold, an engineering firm very familiar with thermal energy networks, to do some head-to-head modeling of thermal energy networks against other technologies. This was specifically asked for in the legislation, asked to look at a number of factors of different energy systems, a baseline, which would be a fossil fuel heating system and traditional air conditioning, air source heat pumps, and a hybrid heat pump natural gas system. So Borough Happold and the board and Rutgers chose 6 neighborhood typologies, types of neighborhoods that are very characteristic of New Jersey, and modeled these neighborhoods with all system types to look at the impacts of the different systems. In 3 of these, we took waste heat and we added waste heat to the neighborhoods. In the urban mixed use, that was a low temperature waste heat source. We used wastewater treatment plant. And in both the office park and the hospital campus, a higher heat source, which was a data center, was added to the neighborhood, and that could be added in or taken out to see how the different systems combined. And as you can see, we looked at energy consumption, peak demand, greenhouse gas emissions, and life cycle cost. And now I'll turn it over to Yousaf to talk about some of the other modeling that we did.
Thanks, Arah. Hi, everyone. So excited to be here and share this exciting work. We'll jump in some of the methodology for the spatial modeling for this report and some of the peak demand modeling before diving into the deep technical results. So the spatial analysis was aimed to produce a visual representation of the state's physical potential, identify areas with balanced heating and cooling loads, evaluate areas with sufficient thermal capacity to meet the peak demand sustainably, and highlight priority census tracts with the greatest community benefits. So in the first step, we collected the building data, which are general characteristics on the type, size, vintage, the existing HVAC systems. Then we estimated the heating and cooling load balance, which is an essential component for the long-term sustainability of the thermal loop. We assessed the borehole feasibility based on available space, the right-of-way, and the local geologies. And we finally compared that potential against the peak demand. The second step of this analysis was a policy screening layer where we overlaid the community factors like income, proximity to the waste heat, the GHG reduction potential, the availability of anchor sites or large campus buildings, and the existing heating fuel types. Together, these two feeds into a final overlay and a screening step that flags the highest priority areas for thermal energy network deployment. So I would suggest think of this less as where TENS exist, but more as where TENS will make more sense when deployed. So next up was when we looked at the 6 typology, the next natural step was scaling up some of that peak demand analysis from building typologies to the statewide system peak. The building load data was used from the 2 DOE models, Comstock and Restock. They both cover commercial and residential buildings. With these data sets, we were able to get a 15-minute interval load profiles, which is a defensible resolution you need to capture the coincidental peak. That's actually when multiple buildings hit their peak demand at the same time, which is ultimately when the grid is strained, not just when a single building hits its own peak demand. From there, we layered the electrification scenarios. We translated those thermal loads into electrical demand for 2 heat pump scenarios, air source heat pump and ground source heat pumps, which are thermal energy networks. The model used performance adjusted for the weather profiles, and we ran those building level profiles and aggregated them up to estimate system-wide coincidental peak to see how large it is and when it hits. Right. So talking briefly about the core benefits in terms of energy efficiency for these systems, air source heat pumps are tied to outdoor air temperatures, which we all know when it's pretty cold outside, they work harder and gets less efficient. Ground source heat pumps don't have that problem. They're pulling the heat from the ground, which stays at a much more stable temperature year round. That consistency, what engineers would love to call it, is a stable COP or coefficient of performance, is actually what unlocks a lot what we are going to show you in the upcoming slides. But particularly on the peak demand and system sizing. When you look at the table on the right, you can see what translates that into practice. TENS reduces annual energy consumptions ranging from 76% to 80% below baseline across all typologies, consistently outperforming air source heat pumps. And when the waste heat is added, some typologies push even further. The hospital campus scenario, for example, hits 97% reduction with a data center source, which is a big number in terms of overall energy reduction. So talking about the peak demand in a much larger context, we all know right now New Jersey is a summer peaking system. Demand spikes in July and August, driven by air conditioning, and that's what have been shaping the grid investments and electricity cost in the PJM region for decades. But as we electrify heating, that's going to change. The chart on the right, based on a well-established literature, shows what full electrification does to the demand curve across the year. What you're seeing is the emergence of what's called a falcon curve, where you get 2 peaks, one in a summer and a new larger one in winter, driven by the heating loads, with a dip in the shoulder seasons in between. The shape looks like a falcon wing, and they have given it the name, the falcon curve. The dotted yellow line at the top represents the worst case, which is like 100% electrification at a COP of 1, which is basically electric resistance heating. As the COP improves, the winter spikes comes down significantly, which is exactly the argument for high efficiency systems like TENS. So the key takeaway is simple. The technology choice, what we make today, will determine how the shape of this curve will be and how investment or infrastructure investments needs to be built in terms of the sustainability of the future. So let's talk about some of the typology results based on the 6 typologies. So here's what we found across the building typologies, and the consistency of this pattern that you'll see in the upcoming slides is one of the most compelling parts of this whole analysis. In every typology we looked, large-scale geothermal systems or TENS reduces peak electrical demand compared to both air source heat pumps and hybrid systems. In residential system, the new peaks are even lower than the current summer peaks. 2 things are driving that. First, the stable temperatures we just talked about, and second, the current baseline inefficiency or lower efficiency of current cooling equipment in the residential sector. The result clearly demonstrates that TENS outperform other options. Next up. We see the similar results for other typologies, for urban residential, urban mixed use, office park, and hospital campuses, where TENS are a much better technology choice when it comes to peak mitigation compared to air source heat pump or hybrid air source heat pumps. Next slide. So when we scale these results up to the full state, the pattern holds, and we can put some real numbers to it. Under full air source heat pump electrification, peak demand increased significantly since we are adding a lot of new electrical load. But under a geothermal scenario, the modeling shows roughly a 40% reduction in coincidental peak compared to air source heat pump. These results reflect a theoretical upper bound impact under a near universal adoption. But it translates into something very concrete: avoided transmission and distribution infrastructure. When you lower the peak, you reduce how much the grid has to be upgraded to handle it. So again, geothermal is more peak resilient pathway, even with a gradual real world uptake. So this is going to be one of the most interesting slides. On the left, you are seeing how peak electrical demand changes under different scenarios across our building typologies. Air source heat pumps drive up the peak demand, TENS bring it down. We covered that in the previous results across typologies as well. But the third case introduces something different: TENS that are pulling in waste heat from external sources. Wastewater treatment plants, data centers, industrial facilities, all of the waste heat that's available for these systems. Thermal energy that's being generated anyway and just released into the environment. When you integrate that waste heat into the network, the peak demand or the peak drops even further. And in some cases, it not just drops, it actually falls below the baseline. And like you can see in the hospital campus, TENS plus data centers reduces the peak below baseline, and similarly for the office park plus data center, TENS plus data center in the office park scenario. So can we go back to the previous slide? Yes. So just to add on, so waste heat offsets parts of the thermal load, so the heat pumps don't have to work. So that's a primary reason for the reduction in the peak. That directly lowers electrical demand. But another important part that's easy to miss is the integration of waste heat also reduces the peak thermal load that determines how large the bore field needs to be in the first place, which is a very big capital investment decision at the design phase. So you're not just saving electricity, you're building less infrastructure to deliver the same results. So that's the shift that's really important to walk away with, that waste heat integration moves TEN not just from peak mitigation into more fundamental in decision making around the economics of the entire system. So now we'll go back towards the spatial modeling, which we talked about in our very early slides. When we are evaluating sites or neighborhoods for TENS, one of the first things we look at is the load balance. How well is the heating and cooling demand in an area match each other? This matters because a ground coupled system is essentially borrowing and returning heat from the earth. So over the time, these two sites needs to be roughly balanced out. If one consistently outweighs the other, the temperature drifts and the system efficiency starts to suffer. We analyze this at a census tract level and use a plus minus 30% difference as our practical threshold for balance following industrial benchmarks and published literature as well. What the map shows is that really large share of New Jersey falls within that range. That's encouraging. It means the physical foundation for TENS deployment is there across much of the state. And just to keep in mind, this is a conservative view. Real networks span multiple tracts. It crosses the tract boundaries, which typically improves balance even further. Next slide. So now the next step was to map that physical potential with the peak heating and cooling demand for the modeled building synthetic data. This is where the spatial analysis actually gets tangible. We are comparing what the ground can actually deliver against what buildings actually need at peak. The large map in the center shows the story at the statewide level. The green areas, which is most of the New Jersey, are tracked where geothermal potential exceeds the peak demand, using it to 75 feet boreholes. That's a good result. But when you zoom into the dense northeastern corridor, you start seeing some shift in the colors, some yellow and red, meaning the ground capacity falls short of what's needed at a 275. So going deeper improves these constraints. But some areas still remains underserved. So that's the case. We need deeper boreholes to meet the peak demand. So now talking about the prioritization. So we have the thermal balance. We know about the peak demand mapping. So the peak, and now let's talk about some of the peak or some of the community benefits matrix layer. Building together on top of these technical insights and identifying where TENS deployment is both technical viable and where it would do the most in terms of the community benefits. This map is one illustration of the capabilities of this analysis where we can prioritize or rank areas based on the required goals or outputs, so a fully customizable layer. The point of this analysis is to help direct investments toward places where conditions align, where thermal profile fits, and where systems can be physically built and where communities would get the largest or greatest benefits. That's what turns a promising technology into real deployment strategy. Next slide. So so beyond just talking about some of the other benefits, beyond energy efficiency, TENS deliver meaningful climate benefits. And this chart makes it pretty clear when you are looking at a 25-year operational GHG reductions across all 6 typologies, comparing the fossil fuel baseline against hybrid systems, air source heat pumps, and TENS. The dark brown bars are the baseline, and in every single typology, TENS have the shortest or bar representing the least GHG emissions. The gap is most dramatic in typologies like office park and hospital campuses, where the baseline emissions are highest to begin with. So TENS aren't just incrementally better, they're cutting emissions to a substantial margin over the life of the system. And the climate benefits don't actually stop at carbon. By eliminating combustion on site, TENS also improve indoor and outdoor air quality, which is particularly relevant in the dense urban areas and for communities that have historically carried a disproportionate pollution burden. Combined with the resilience advantage during extreme heat or cold events, the environmental case for TENS goes well beyond the GHG numbers on this chart. So now for the financial picture, and just to be upfront, this is where we start to see some real tension around TENS, but we'll get to the assumptions and some of the key takeaways from this. The good news, across all 6 typologies, large-scale geothermal has lower total lifetime cost than other electrification alternatives. Compared to air source heat pumps or hybrid systems, TENS wins on the life cycle cost. The harder reality TENs are still more expensive over the lifetime than the baseline, meaning continuing with the existing fuel system. So if you're building owner, running a straight financial comparison with no other considerations, TENs don't win today. That's one core barrier. But the standout exception is the office park typology with waste heat integration. In that scenario, TENs beat everything, including the baseline. So that points towards the proof that shows what's possible with when the right pieces actually come together for these systems. Some also worth flagging, this analysis did not include incentives and borehole cost data. At the time of the study, there was a lot of uncertainty around financial incentives, and the cost data for boreholes is still very limited, which likely means we are slightly overstating the cost burden for TENs. As more projects get built and we have better data to work with, we expect the economics to shift in the favor. There is already a lot of deep thoughts going around leveraging the ITCs for these systems, and which makes economics in a much more favorable way for these systems. So just to summarize the comparative advantage of TENs versus the baseline technology, as we discussed, they beat the baseline technologies for annual energy consumptions, 25-year GHG emissions, and in some cases beat the peak electrical demand. However, for life cycle costs without the integration of waste heat, TENs do struggle with the baseline technologies. However, when we talk about other electrification technologies, like we talked about air source heat pumps, hybrid air source heat pumps, TENs outperform both in all the scenarios. So against other electrification technologies, TENs are the best technology to start with. And with that, I'll hand it over to Arah to go towards some of the barriers and recommendations.
Thanks, Yousaf. I got a little excited about flipping those slides there. Sorry about that. So when we were looking at the barriers, we broke them down into 3 categories. The first is the financial barriers, as Yousaf just explained. The upfront capital required for TENs, in particular the boreholes, are substantial, and the payback can exceed 10 years, sometimes stretch into the 15+ year time frame. This is a tough sell for a lot of property developers. And there's also a mismatch between capital structure for development and the payback time when there's operational savings that can't always be applied to the capital costs of developing the system. In addition, traditional lenders have limited familiarity, not only with thermal energy networks, but with geothermal heating and cooling in general. So even though these technologies have been around for decades, they can be seen to be risky, and it makes it hard to find kind of traditional low-cost financing for systems like this. So even though they're not a new technology, they can be considered innovative and considered high risk by lenders. And so they may need incentives or grants or other types of subsidized or creative financing to move forward. The second bucket of barriers is legal and regulatory, and these take a number of flavors. The first is that thermal energy is not a regulated public utility function in New Jersey. So the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities does not have clear oversight into thermal energy networks, which makes it very difficult to have what we have in Massachusetts, which is utility developed and owned and operated thermal energy networks. So in New Jersey, the BPU's statutory jurisdiction covers gas, electric, water, and sewer, but it is silent on thermal energy with narrow exceptions. So there's really not a path to implementing utility-owned thermal energy networks that can be regulated at scale. The second is the obligation to serve. Every state has an obligation to serve statute. New Jersey's which applies to utilities. New Jersey's statute is fairly broad. It does not specify specific utility services like gas. However, the statute requires utilities to provide service upon reasonable demand, And so if a thermal energy network was displacing gas in a neighborhood and a gas customer demanded that gas service continue, this could be a risk to the utility and to the thermal energy network. So that is something that has proven to be a barrier in other states where thermal energy network regulation is starting to be applied. There are also challenges with local land use requirements. So things like zoning, siting, franchise agreements. It's less that thermal energy networks or ground source heat pumps are prohibited or restricted in these, but many of these local requirements are silent on the technology. And just like obligation to serve, when there's silence or lack of clarity in these regulations, it can be considered risky for developers and for the municipalities where these might be proposed. And finally is renewable energy. So in New Jersey, ground source heat pumps are not a class 1 renewable under the New Jersey REC statute. Electrical geothermal generation is, but low temperature ground source heat pumps are not. Several other states have either incorporated ground source heat pumps into their RECs class 1 list, or they have a specific thermal energy credit or geothermal energy credit that helps unlock additional financing and funding for these projects. And the final bucket is marketability barriers. This is a word that was used in the legislation, but the way that we defined it in the study is basically a lack of familiarity in key industries that would specify, promote, design, and implement these technologies, such as property developers, architects, MEP consultants, and other design professionals who look at heating and cooling systems. So what were our recommendations on how to resolve these? The first one was to resolve the regulatory barriers. So this is a map of other states in the US that have addressed some of these regulatory barriers, specifically around utility thermal energy networks. As I mentioned in the beginning, the legislation directed the study to identify specific actions. So the first was legislative, so to address both the obligation to serve and the authority of the Board of Public Utilities to regulate thermal energy networks. In other states, legislation has directed the gas utilities either that they could or that they must propose pilot thermal energy networks. So that's something that could be done in New Jersey as well. For potential municipal ownership of TENS, the study states New Jersey's Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act of 2019. That provided a pathway to municipal stormwater utilities, very similar structural model for how a municipal thermal utility could look. And so one suggestion is that legislation, that law could be expanded to municipally owned and operated thermal energy networks. And finally, as I mentioned, the study recommends extending the class 1 RECs or creating a thermal energy credit for thermal energy networks, geothermal heating and cooling. The second recommendation was to really focus on new construction. Thermal energy networks, like many other things, are more feasible both financially and technically when you're building from scratch rather than retrofitting a number of buildings and changing the system from something to a thermal energy network. So the recommendations here were to several things to address new construction specifically. One was an amendment to New Jersey's municipal land use law to add thermal energy networks as a beneficial use. This has been done for solar and other clean technologies. When this goes into the municipal land use law, it supersedes local zoning barriers. So if it's considered a beneficial use, then it's much more difficult to prevent these technologies through zoning and other local regulations. We recommended a pilot programs targeted specifically at new construction and an information and education effort targeting some of those professions that I mentioned before to really provide information, education, knowledge, site visits and other things to the types of professionals who would develop thermal energy networks. The final recommendation was on pilots. So recommended looking at a number of things to de-risk projects, including early in the implementation pipeline. So before you spend your 10, 20, $30 million to build a thermal energy network, there's a lot of work that has to be done at risk to even assess the feasibility of a system like this. So everything from some of the site specifications that Yousaf showed in the tool, is there enough room for the boreholes? You would have to do test boreholes to see if the geology and the subsurface conditions are amenable to TENS, et cetera. A lot of that risk prevents projects from even starting down the development pipeline. So one recommendation was financial or technical assistance pilots to help support the early stage development. A second was to integrate thermal energy networks specifically into some of the existing clean energy programs, including the large energy user program. This is for entities like hospitals, office parks, higher education campuses, which are very amenable, and actually many have geothermal systems, as well as the new construction program. And finally, to focus on something that's a little bit easier than most of what the study covered, which is single customer multi-building systems. Again, those campuses that are owned by a single entity where you don't have to address the cross-property, cross-utility customer barriers that the multi-customer TENS see. We suggested that partnerships could really help with the marketability and just general knowledge and interest in this technology. So developing partnerships with academic institutions, a little bit self-serving, nonprofit organizations and industry groups. There are national and international geothermal groups. There are many practitioners in New Jersey to address the marketability and market diffusion barriers. Increase the study and knowledge of these systems. As Yousaf mentioned, more and more of these systems are being proposed, developed. There's now cost information from other states. There's beginning to be operational information. So starting to bring that knowledge together and creating a New Jersey Center of Excellence for Thermal Energy Networks. The picture here is a research consortium that HEAT has developed that is doing some of that, primarily in the Northeast, but in other parts of the country where thermal energy networks are being developed. And that is it. That's what we studied and released in February. This QR code or the link will take you to the study, which is a mere 160 pages. So, good weekend read for you. And I'll turn it back to Marjorie.
Thank you so much, Arah, Yousaf, and Jen. This has been great and really chocked full of a lot of information. And so we've had a pretty healthy response in the chat, and so that'll give us time to get into some of the questions in a more meaty way, I think, since you're a little bit ahead of schedule. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Lucas, who's been curating all of your questions. And so go for it, Luke.
All right, thanks. I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between Yousaf and Arah for questions. So Yousaf, first question is to you. This is from Ken Dolsky. He asked, did you consider the effect of a virtual power plant on these scenarios? Virtual power plants can reduce peak loads by themselves and can increase the efficiency of any heating cooling system.
Yes, two things. Yes to the second part and no to the first. The VPPs are not included in this analysis as the legislation called out like a head-to-head modeling of these standalone systems against baseline or other technologies that are out there in the market. However, now a lot of work is underway for in terms of VPP, so more to come. Stay tuned on that. But like I said, these systems are well suited to work with battery storage, thermal energy storage. So yes, there is a very good, strong case and literature around there for these systems, but VPPs were not part of the scope of the study. So yeah, these are just standalone TENS for now.
Thanks, Yousaf. All right, Arah, next question is for you. This comes from David Devoren. He asks, can New Jersey's EDA CPACE program alleviate or mitigate the financial barriers to TEN?
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning EDA. I didn't mention that while we're in the process of developing this study, EDA released a grant program called Retrofit New Jersey that is focused on building decarbonization with a specific track for multi-building thermal energy networks. So there is an existing grant program out there from EDA specifically for thermal energy networks. It's quite robust and a really fantastic program. You know, I'm not an expert on what can be layered and stacked and braided, but certainly any type of kind of financing specifically for energy efficiency and clean energy would be useful. In the case of CPACE, you know, my understanding of CPACE is as long as there's energy efficiency involved, then CPACE can apply. And as you saw in Yousaf's presentation, this is certainly a technology that is more energy efficient than the other technologies.
Great, thank you. Yousaf, next question is from Betsy Longendorfer. She asks, why are some locations not balanced in heating and cooling? Is there a particular type of usage that causes that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And there are a number of reasons for seeing some parts not being balanced in that analysis. One, we all know the underrepresentation of cooling systems like in New Jersey, and then again the dominance of heating systems and heating profiles for the building stock in New Jersey. However, one very important thing to keep in mind is these are aggregated results at the census tract level, which somehow where we know that when you go at the granularity of building levels at each parcel, which won't be easier to see in a map, because we have 3.1 million parcels in New Jersey, actually a little bit over that. But when you aggregate them, so some areas came out to be unbalanced, but at individual building levels, the load profiles are well in balance. But once we have more data on the cooling representation, these results will further improve as well. Currently, we all know not all buildings in New Jersey have air conditioning system. So cooling is underrepresented in a lot of data sets that are publicly out there. And that's the case for all the northeastern states, actually, where cooling is not as represented in the data as heating is. So yeah, some caveats to that.
Thanks, Yousaf. The next question for Arah, though this can be open to anyone who might be able to answer it, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. This is from Stanislav Jarax, asking, what is the serviceability of ground-based geo-exchange systems versus air-based heat pumps? And what is the expected service life, and what happens to the underground pipes after that? Are they recovered or recycled?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I might ask Yousaf to jump in here with some of the assumptions in the Burrow-Happold modeling. But the in-building, above-ground equipment is similar to an air source heat pump or, you know, many kind of traditional technologies. What's particularly great about a ground source heat pump and a thermal energy network is that the underground components of the system have an extremely long lifespan. So equivalent to gas type infrastructure, 50 years plus. As I mentioned, a number of these systems, Rutgers University has several, have been around for decades and are still performing. Like other underground pipe systems, you know, there's potential that they could leak or fail and they can be dug up and replaced. They are often left in place if for some reason the system is decommissioned, and they are usually full of water with a little bit of glycol. So it's a non-toxic fluid that's circulating in these pipes. Yousaf, did you want to add anything about the assumptions or the equipment?
Yeah, I mean, Arah, you just covered almost all the points in terms of the service life. So New Jersey has around more than 3,000 of these systems, like single individual ground source heat pump systems. And some of them have been around for more than over a decade. If we look at the DP's data on the boreholes that, like the wells that have been drilled in the 90s, even before 90s, are still there and operational. So these systems have a much longer life than other technologies. When we talk about the ground loop, that material is no foreign. It's just a standard HDPE pipes, which are around there in the industry for many, many years. They do not have the issues around rust, corrosion. So yeah, so they have the longevity of the system is very good.
All right, I'm going to ask one of the more recent questions to Jen. Have you guys given consideration to suggesting that the local redevelopment and housing law be amended to include TENS as optional element to be included in redevelopment plans? They ask if this might be useful in overcoming issues with multi-tenant TENS.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I saw that question from Anne and I wanted to answer it. I think that's a great suggestion. We didn't include that in our recommendations, but we certainly could. For those of you who are familiar with New Jersey's redevelopment and housing law, it's quite powerful and essentially allows negotiated outcomes at sort of the level of a project or municipality. But this would be a great way to try to promote the benefits of TENS generally. So I wanted to thank you for that question, and it's a good idea.
Great.
And Lucas, I'd like to jump in and answer. I saw a question about environmental impact of TENS.
Sure.
I would just mention, and I was remiss in not mentioning this in the beginning, that we had a number of state agency partners in this study. The BPU, from day one to the day it was published, was a tremendous partner, both their clean energy division as well as their legal team. But we also worked with the Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, who did a lot of review of the content of the study, input on local environmental laws and regulations, as well as the EDA, who not only helped us understand their programs, but reviewed the entire financial barriers section. So a number of state agencies were involved in the production of the study.
Great, thank you.
And just to add something to the same response, Arah, these systems are usually closed loop systems, so not much around the danger of something leaking out to the ground. And like I said, these systems has been around in New Jersey for many decades. So DEP has a very robust permitting requirements around these systems to ensure the environment, to minimize the environmental impacts. And they don't have much environmental impacts as I said. It's a closed loop system. The systems, there's nothing that's flowing out of the systems, and just the ground loop that's in there, and well-established technology as well.
Great. Yousaf, next question is from Russ Fernari. Wanted to know, how would existing infrastructure and or below ground contamination impact this or be mitigated? One concern with boreholes would be to ensure contamination is not provided a pathway to deeper geological layers or aquifers.
Yeah, so like I said, closed loop systems, we know New Jersey has around 800 feet boreholes that are around for some of the systems. And the DP regulations are very stringent. In terms of in-building conditions or existing infrastructure, it's just with any retrofit, when you look at the existing infrastructure, if the existing infrastructure is a technology that can work well with TENS, then that's a plus. Otherwise, it's just some small lift in terms of the financial cost for changing the infrastructure. In terms of geology, I think New Jersey has a very favorable geology. It's just the for these systems, it's just the matter of cost that will differ based on different geologies. Based on the thermal conductivities, based on different areas. And that's an area where we are expecting a lot of more data to come in the future years.
Thank you. Arah, next question is from Maura Caraselli. She asks, what are the benefits of municipal versus utility ownership?
That isn't something we dug into in the study. We were agnostic as to the type of ownership. So I think I won't answer that question. I guess one thing I'll say is that both the utility and the municipality, those who have stormwater utilities, have experience running a similar system and business model, right, with customers and infrastructure that needs to be maintained, et cetera. But the study did not go into differentiating between ownership models. There are also private models. So there are new construction. There's a place in Georgia, two developments in Georgia and one in Texas, and perhaps others that are privately owned and operated. So they built a huge subdivision with hundreds of homes, and there's a privately owned thermal energy network that supports the community. So there are numerous types of ownership models.
Thank you. Jen, I don't know if you can answer this next question from Maura Caraselli as well. It seems that the city of Trenton was identified in part as being imbalanced, but also an area of highest community benefit. Can you speak to those potential conflicts?
Yes, and I can ask others to jump in. Hi, Maura. I think this was probably answered by Yousaf in terms of why we sometimes see imbalances. And so Trenton, as a city with some more community need or lower and moderate income populations, tends to lack more cooling installed in the building stock. And so, that's coming together then obviously with that need. Hopefully through some of the existing clean energy and utility programs, we will see the installation of cooling in buildings as something that kind of beyond this report, but could be talked about as, cooling as a right, with climate change and the need to ensure that all populations have access to cooling. Not sure, Yusuf, if there's something that you want to add to that or if I'm specifically addressing Maura's question.
Uh, I think it's just the one thing could be the scaling of both these maps where we are not zooming into the other one because some census tracts are marked as unbalanced, but I think are not labeled as security zones. But since one map is zoomed in and the other one is not, so that might be a confusion there. However, the screening framework is very consistent. We start with the balance, we start with the technical potential against the peak demand, and then go toward the policy screening or community benefit layers. So the technology layers are first screened out. So yeah, but yeah, that's the process of the analysis, and we would love to take another look if there's a mismatch. But the scale might be another factor for.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Yusuf. No, I think, yeah, Maura, I think you're correct in just sort of identifying, right, the unfortunate opposition of, where there may be more community need, versus what that building stock looks like.
Yusuf, next question is for Michael Bianchi. He brings up the issue of thermal energy networks and passive house buildings and asks if building insulation was any part of this study.
So no other, I think the other ECMs were not considered to be part of the study because we were comparing this head to head with the baseline. So no other ECMs were considered. It was just a retrofit of TENS versus the baseline HVAC technologies. Other ECMs were not part of the study.
Yeah.
Installation or weatherization. Yeah.
All buildings were assumed to be code compliant in the head-to-head analysis.
Great. Arah, next question is from David DeVoren. Is another barrier the technical skills needed to implement these systems? How many vendors are capable of implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. The legislation did not mention workforce. There's a short section in there about the workforce. In the interviews that we did with sites that have existing large-scale geothermal, none of them cited workforce as being an issue. That doesn't mean the local workforce is there. So there are well diggers in New Jersey, but a lot of the larger systems actually brought geothermal rigs and drillers in from other states. So I think those are two different questions. Is there a workforce and is there a local workforce? An interesting thing about TENS is that it uses many of the same skill sets and skilled workforce that the gas utilities do. And so in other states, it has been proposed as a way to transition the gas utility. So a pipes to pipes transition that uses the skilled workforce and uses a lot of the same equipment. So all of that is mentioned briefly in the study.
Okay. And one follow-up question. Do your TENS life cycle costs include the benefits of peak reductions?
So I think Yousaf framed this. That life cycle cost analysis is an owner's look. So basically the owner's life cycle analysis. It's not a societal benefit cost analysis. We are doing a number of work streams coming out of this study, and one of them is seeing if we can apply a benefit cost analysis to 10 systems that has more of a societal look at the benefits. Peak reduction would be one of those. So the shorter answer is only if a building, a commercial building was on a rate that had a peak charge, would that be taken into the developer's LCA look. Otherwise, it's really a societal benefit, which, as we sort of showed, is significant.
Great, thank you. Jen, next question is from John Colano. If district thermal systems have already been successful in dense cities and internationally, what parts of their success can actually transfer to New Jersey, and what parts might not because of differences in density, regulation, ownership, fuel source, or customer demand?
Did you say Jen, Luke?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was gonna
Okay. Hi,
copy
John.
us.
Yeah, good question. We've covered in the presentation and obviously in more detail in the report where different regulatory regimes matter, and the answer is that can matter a lot. In terms of density, I guess I would sort of like reframe that in terms of like balancing heating and cooling loads, right? So it's kind of more important to sort of understand where we have the technical conditions to support TENS. Obviously, if we're trying to connect multiple buildings over a very wide expanse of land, there will be more capital cost. But so from that perspective, density might be favorable, but it's also very difficult if we're talking about retrofitting the built environment to do that in an, urban dense area. In terms of different fuel types, that mostly comes through the life cycle costing or any sort of subsequent benefit cost analysis. And so that kind of comes down to looking at like the differential between electricity and other like baseline fuels that might be considered in the head-to-head. And so that influences operational cost and therefore the life cycle cost.
I'll just note that you didn't see delivered fuels in the head-to-head, and the BPU decided after we looked at some initial work is that delivered fuels are used in areas that are low density enough that a TENS would be financially infeasible because of those long connections between buildings. So it was not, the full head-to-head was not modeled.
So Lucas, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Last questions to Yousaf. Robert Urich asks, could a 10 be financially feasible in a micro community level, such as on one property, which is a community residential development, such as multiple townhouses?
The answer to that, I think, is yes, but an important factor that really plays in favor of TENS, like Arah just mentioned, are two things: diversity and density of the loads. That's a very important factor for financial feasibility of these systems. Like I said, there are individual homeowners who have installed these systems for many, many years, but the reason of moving towards TENS is, again, the diversity of the loads. So you have a thermal synergy between different buildings, which not only makes system more efficient, but reduces the capital investment cost, also provide benefits towards the peak mitigation as well. So it really depends on the diversity and the density of those micro housing communities as well, how well that system behave when it's deployed. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yousaf. Jen or Arah, did you want to add anything else to what Yousaf said there?
Nope.
We
That was
good?
great.
So I've put in the chat the links for the Thermal Energy Networks report. So where you can access it again, as well as links to our May 27th virtual conversation with the Chief Resilience Officers from New Jersey and Philadelphia, and our June 10th New Jersey Climate Change Research Symposium, and where you can find today's webinar recording. We would love to have you join us for any or all of these events, and thank you so much to this amazing team: Jennifer Senick, Arah, Schuur, Yousaf, Shahid. You guys are secret weapons, as I said, with amazing resources and amazing knowledge. So we're so grateful for that. And again, thank you to Lucas and to Oliver, who've been helping us. And I think that takes us to the adjournment of today's and conclusion of today's webinar.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you
Yeah,
for
thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.